Middlemarch by George Eliot. Dorothea Brooke was a young woman of striking beauty, not because of elegant dresses or dazzling jewellery, but through her quiet grace and an intense longing for purpose. While her younger sister Celia dressed simply yet charmingly, Dorothea's plainness was deliberate, a reflection of her desire to live a meaningful life, untouched by vanity. The sisters lived at Tipton Grange, under the care of their kind but absent-minded uncle, Mr. Brooke. Their life was comfortable, quiet, predictable, but Dorothea dreamed of something greater. Where others sought romance and leisure, she yearned for a mission, a way to serve a higher cause. But not everyone understood Dorothea's mind, especially Sir James Chetham. Sir James, a wealthy baronet, was captivated by Dorothea. He mistook her passion for building better cottages for the poor as a sign of affection for him. He eagerly embraced her ideas, offering to fund the project, believing it would bring them closer to him. Dorothea was the perfect future wife, intelligent, kind, and noble-hearted. Yet Dorothea, absorbed in her ideals, never saw him as a suitor. She assumed his interest was in Celia, not herself. Celia, however, saw the truth. She noticed Sir James's attempts to impress Dorothea, even gifting her a tiny Maltese puppy, a gesture Dorothea found ridiculous. Dorothea said, "I prefer animals with a purpose." Sir James blinked in confusion, while Celia quietly hid a smile. During a carriage ride home, Celia finally spoke the truth. Celia said, "You know Sir James is in love with you?" Dorothea stared at her sister, stunned. Dorothea replied, "He thinks of me as a future sister." But Celia, having overheard the servants' gossip, insisted. Celia said, "Sir James means to propose." Dorothea was horrified, not just by the misunderstanding, but by the thought that her plans for the cottages now seemed less like acts of reform and more like romantic gestures. How could she continue working with Sir James? Knowing his true intentions, her heart and mind, however, were set elsewhere, on Mr. Casaubon, a solemn, middle-aged clergyman from Lowick. Mr. Casaubon was entirely devoted to his life's work, an ambitious book titled The Key to All Mythologies, aiming to uncover the hidden connections between ancient religions and divine truth. To Dorothea, this was not just scholarship, it was a sacred mission. She saw Casaubon as a modern saint, Augustine, a man of deep intellect who could guide her toward a higher purpose. She imagined marriage not as a romantic union, but as a partnership of the mind, helping him in his great work, believing that through him her life would gain meaning. Or one day, during a quiet conversation, Mr. Casaubon spoke of his loneliness. Mr. Casaubon said, "The presence of a youthful companion might lighten the burdens of scholarly solitude." Dorothea's heart raced. To her, this was not a simple comment. It was a sign, an invitation to a life of purpose. Yet, cracks in her idealistic vision began to show. When Dorothea eagerly explained her plans to build better cottages for the poor, Mr. Casaubon barely reacted. Mr. Casaubon said, "The small dwellings of ancient Egyptians also had interesting structures." It was a small moment, but telling. His world was rooted in abstract ideas, not practical reforms. Ironically, it was Sir James who embraced Dorothea's vision. Sir James said, "I will build new cottages on my estate, following your designs exactly." For the first time, Dorothea found Sir James less annoying. Perhaps, she thought, he might serve a purpose as Celia's husband, helping to fulfill her vision for social reform. Then everything changed. Loving the story? Please don't forget to like and subscribe. One evening, Mr. Brooke, in his usual meandering way, casually revealed a shocking piece of news. Mr. Brooke said, "Casaubon has asked for my permission to propose to you." Dorothea's response was immediate and firm. Dorothea said, "If he makes me an offer, I shall accept him. I admire and honour him more than any man I have ever met." Mr. Brooke, surprised, having thought Sir James was the more suitable match, hesitated. Mr. Brooke said, "Well, Casaubon is over 45, you know. Not young, and perhaps not the strongest." But Dorothea's mind was made up. Dorothea replied, "I wish to marry a man above me in judgment and knowledge." Then came the letter. Mr. Casaubon's proposal was as formal and heavy as the man himself, full of long sentences about his need for a companion who could lighten his solitude and assist him in his scholarly work. He spoke less of love and more of the practical, intellectual benefits their marriage would bring, describing Dorothea as someone eminently fitted to aid him. For Dorothea, however, the letter was everything she had hoped for. She wasn't seeking romance, she was seeking purpose, with a heart pounding, not with passion, but with resolve. Dorothea wrote back. Dorothea wrote, "I am very grateful to you for loving me and thinking me worthy to be your wife. I can look forward to no better happiness than that which would be one with yours." The next morning, Celia noticed Dorothea's strange quietness. At first, she thought her sister was still upset about Sir James, but when Mr. Brooke mentioned that Mr. Casaubon would be joining them for dinner, Celia noticed Dorothea's rare blush. For the first time, it dawned on Celia. This wasn't just intellectual admiration. Celia asked softly, "Are you engaged to Mr. Casaubon?" Dorothea, still firm in her decision, answered calmly. Dorothea said, "Yes, I am very, very happy." Celia was stunned. Celia said, "Oh, Dodo, I hope you will be happy." And so the stage was set. Dorothea, full of blind idealism, Mr. Casaubon, lost in his scholarly world, Sir James, still clinging to hope, and Celia, watching it all with quiet disbelief. The threads of fate tightened, pulling them all toward a future none of them truly understood. As news of Dorothea's engagement spread, Mrs. Cadwallader, the rector's wife, could not hide her dismay. She was a woman known for her sharp wit and even sharper tongue, always at the heart of Middlemarch's conversations. She had long imagined Sir James Chetham as Dorothea's future husband, a match that made sense in every way. But now Dorothea had chosen Mr. Casaubon, a man far older, quiet, and absorbed in his endless studies. At Tipton Grange, Mrs. Cadwallader confronted Celia, who confirmed the engagement. "My dear child, what is this about your sister's engagement?" Walia, simple and direct as always, replied. "She is engaged to Mr. Casaubon." Mrs. Cadwallader froze. "This is frightful. How long has this madness been going on?" Celia sighed. "I only found out yesterday. They are to be married in 6 weeks. Determined to warn Sir James, Mrs. Cadwallader hurried to Freshitt Hall, where she found him preparing to ride to Tipton Grange. She told him outright Dorothea was to marry Casaubon. Sir James was stunned, the words striking him harder than he had expected. Good God! He is no better than a mummy, he exclaimed. He insisted that Mr. Brooke should delay the marriage, that given time Dorothea would come to her senses. But Mrs. Cadwallader knew Brooke was too indecisive to interfere. Then, with a knowing smile, she remarked, "Celia is worth 2 of Dorothea, and I believe she admires you quite a bit." Sir James rode hard for half an hour, the cold wind sharp against his face. He had lost Dorothea, and with her the dream of guiding her ambitions, shaping her ideals. But as the sting faded, a new thought began to take shape. Celia is worth 2 of her. Had he been blind? Celia, soft-spoken, kind, always there, always watching, always listening. She had never sought to change the world, only to be a part of it with quiet grace. As his horse slowed its pace, he realized that his path had changed, and without quite knowing why, he turned toward Tipton Grange after all. As the weeks passed, Mr. Casaubon spent more time at Tipton Grange, his courtship of Dorothea progressing steadily. Though he had expected deep emotion, he found love to be a much weaker force than the poets had described. Still, he took comfort in Dorothea's devotion and willingness to serve him. One morning, Dorothea asked if she could learn Latin and Greek, hoping to assist him in his studies. Mr. Casaubon agreed, pleased by her eagerness. But as she struggled with the lessons, he began to feel that some knowledge was never meant for women. One afternoon, Mr. Brooke entered the library, smiling at their lesson. "Too taxing for a woman, don't you think?" he remarked. Casaubon replied, "She is simply saving my eyes." Mr. Brooke, watching them together, could not help but wonder, why had she chosen him? Despite his disappointment, Sir James Chetham continued visiting Tipton Grange. Seeing Dorothea after her engagement was painful, but he felt no jealousy toward Mr. Casaubon, only pity for Dorothea's choice. Believing the marriage was a mistake, Sir James sought advice from Mr. Cadwallader, a clergyman known for his calm and easygoing nature. Somebody should speak to Brooke, Sir James insisted. The rector smiled. About politics? No, about Dorothea's marriage. She is too young to know what she wants. Mr. Cadwallader was not convinced. Casaubon isn't a bad man. He takes care of his poor relations. A man may act justly and still be lifeless, Sir James argued. Mrs. Cadwallader entered, amused. Well, he has a trout stream. That must count for something. Sir James left feeling helpless. Dorothea was free to make her mistake, and no one could stop her. Yet, as he continued his visits, he found himself speaking to Celia more often, and with time he discovered a quiet pleasure in their company. With her wedding approaching, Dorothea visited Lowick Manor, her future home, accompanied by Mr. Brooke and Celia. The house stood in a quiet park, its ancient stone walls and shadowed windows giving it a solemn, unchanging air. Dorothea, with her deep admiration for tradition and knowledge, found it charming and dignified, while Celia, with her lighter nature, thought Freshitt Hall would have been much prettier. As Mr. Casaubon led Dorothea through the house, showing her rooms and asking if she wished for any changes, she refused, content to accept everything as it was. To her the house represented stability, wisdom and devotion, a place where she would dedicate herself to her husband's great work. Even when her uncle suggested new furniture and fresher colours, she insisted that nothing should be altered. Outside, the garden stretched towards a small church, where Mr. Casaubon had once served as rector. As they walked through the grounds, Celia noticed a young man sketching beneath a great yew tree. He was slender, with light brown curls, and seemed out of place among the stillness of Lowick. When they approached, Mr. Casaubon introduced him as Will Ladislaw, his distant cousin. Dorothea observed the young man's restless energy and intense expression, so unlike her fiancé's solemnity. Mr. Brooke picked up his sketchbook, flipping through the pages. "Ah, you are an artist?" he said. "No, I only sketch a little," Will replied, colouring slightly. Dorothea glanced at the drawings, but confessed, "I do not understand pictures, just as I do not understand Greek. They are a language unknown to me." Will's expression darkened. He was already inclined to dislike Dorothea simply because she was marrying Casaubon, and now he imagined she was mocking him. Yet there was something about her voice, soft, rich, full of quiet intensity, that caught his attention. He turned away, dismissing the thought. As they walked on, Mr. Brooke questioned Mr. Casaubon about Ladislaw. The young man, it seemed, had no fixed purpose, drifting between studies and travel without choosing a profession. Casaubon disapproved, seeing Will's restlessness as a lack of discipline. "He refuses to settle. He speaks of culture, but rejects all useful study," Casaubon remarked. "Perhaps he is still growing," Dorothea said gently. "Sometimes we do not yet know what we are meant to do." Celia, amused, later teased her sister. "Being engaged has made you very patient," she observed. Dorothea only smiled, certain that patience and devotion would bring her happiness. Yet, as she looked at Lowick's grey stone walls, standing silent beneath the autumn sky, a faint shadow of doubt passed through her mind. Will Ladislaw left for the continent, drifting without a clear purpose, while Mr. Casaubon, despite winning a young, devoted wife, felt an unexpected emptiness as the wedding neared. Plans were made for their wedding journey, extending as far as Rome, where Casaubon wished to study manuscripts in the Vatican. When he suggested Dorothea bring a companion so she wouldn't be lonely while he worked, she felt a quiet sting. "You must have misunderstood me," she said softly. "I would never take time from your work." Later, at a final dinner party, Dorothea remained calm and poised, unaware of the whispered judgments around her. "Mark my words," Mrs. Cadwallader murmured. "Within a year she will hate him." Meanwhile, Mr. Lydgate, a promising young doctor, observed Dorothea with interest, but dismissed her as too earnest. Soon after, Dorothea Brooke became Mrs. Casaubon. Setting off for Rome on her honeymoon, where her hopes and illusions would be tested and new disappointments awaited, Dorothea, now Mrs. Casaubon, is on her honeymoon in Rome, a time when knowledge of art and history was much less widespread. One morning, Will Ladislaw, Casaubon's young cousin, is in the Vatican with his German artist friend, Adolf Naumann. They come across a striking young woman standing near the reclining marble statue of Ariadne, lost in thought. She is dressed modestly in grey, her hand resting on her cheek. It is Dorothea, unaware that she is being observed. Naumann, captivated by her beauty, is eager to paint her, seeing her as a living contrast to the ancient sculpture, a blend of spiritual depth and physical grace. However, when Dorothea notices them, she immediately turns away. Rejoining her maid and courier, Naumann excitedly tells Will that he wants to follow her home to propose painting her portrait. Will, looking troubled, refuses. Naumann is puzzled by his reaction, but Will explains that Dorothea is married to his cousin. The German jokes that Casaubon looks more like an uncle than a husband. Further irritating Will, as they talk, it becomes clear that Will is unsettled by Dorothea's presence in Rome. He had only met her briefly before she married Casaubon, while Naumann speaks of art and how the universe seems to be drawing him toward painting Dorothea. Will resists, dismissing painting as an inadequate medium compared to language. He argues that no portrait could ever capture a woman's true essence, the depth of her voice, her emotions, or her constant changes. Naumann teases him, suggesting that he is jealous and does not want another man to admire Dorothea. Will, irritated, insists that she is simply Mrs. Casaubon, not his aunt or some idealized figure. Naumann, however, refuses to drop the idea, joking that if he meets Dorothea and she agrees to be painted, Will won't be able to stop him. Will's agitation suggests that his feelings for Dorothea are deeper than he wants to admit. Though he dismisses Naumann's interest in her as an artistic impulse, his own reaction is far more personal. The chapter ends with the sense that Will is caught in an emotional conflict he did not anticipate, one that he does not yet fully understand. "5 weeks into her honeymoon in Rome, Dorothea Casaubon finds herself alone in her boudoir, sobbing. She had married Mr. Casaubon believing she was dedicating herself to a life of intellectual and moral purpose. Instead, she feels lost. Rome, with its overwhelming ruins and history, only deepens her loneliness. Her husband, rather than being the brilliant mentor she had envisioned, is cold, mechanical, and uninspiring. She tries to immerse herself in his scholarly world, but his conversations feel lifeless. When he speaks of art and history, there is no passion, only dry facts. Desperately, she suggests he begin writing his long-planned book and offers to help. Instead of gratitude, he reacts with irritation, taking her words as criticism. For the first time they argue. Dorothea had only wanted to be useful, but Casaubon sees her as an impatient onlooker who does not understand the weight of true scholarship. Their conversation ends in mutual hurt, widening the emotional chasm between them. Later, as they ride silently through the Rome, the depth of their incompatibility becomes painfully clear. Dorothea wanders the Vatican, lost in thought, struggling to reconcile her disillusionment with her sense of duty. It is in this moment of quiet sorrow that Will Ladislaw sees her. Standing among the statues, absorbed in her own world, she appears distant and unreachable. Though she does not notice him, Will is struck by the depth of her emotion, unknowingly drawn to her in a way that foreshadows what is to come. Still shaken from her earlier argument with Mr. Casaubon, Dorothea is surprised when her maid announces a visitor, Will Ladislaw, her husband's young cousin. She agrees to see him, hoping the visit will remind her of Casaubon's kindness and shake her out of her own discontent. When Will enters, he immediately notices Dorothea's tear-streaked face. Her youthful vulnerability, combined with her warm yet composed demeanor, affects him deeply. He struggles to hide his distaste for Casaubon, appalled that the scholar has left his beautiful young wife so isolated. Their conversation flows easily. Will teases her about her past critique of his sketch, and she, in turn, confesses her struggles with appreciating art in Rome. She wonders if he intends to become a painter, but he dismisses the idea, calling it too one-sided. When she mentions Casaubon's concerns about his lack of discipline, Will responds with veiled scorn, criticizing Casaubon's outdated scholarship. Dorothea, offended by Will's flippant attitude, defends her husband's dedication. However, Will's words plant a troubling seed in her mind. What if Casaubon's life's work is futile? For the first time, she begins to doubt its significance. When Casaubon arrives, his presence feels dim compared to Will's youthful energy. Though polite, he is visibly weary. After Will leaves, Dorothea, remorseful over their earlier argument, apologizes. Casaubon accepts, but a subtle distance remains between them. By the end of the day, Dorothea experiences a painful awakening. She realizes that Casaubon will never reciprocate her emotional devotion. Worse, she senses for the first time that he too may be suffering, trapped in his own disappointments just as she is. The next day, with Mr. Casaubon out, Will visits Dorothea alone. She welcomes him warmly, showing him cameos she had bought for Celia. Their conversation drifts to art, and Dorothea admits that while she admires beauty, it saddens her that so much of it seems exclusive, enjoyed only by the privileged. Will, impatient with her idealism, argues that the best way to honor life is to embrace joy, to spread delight. The best piety, he says, is to enjoy. But Dorothea, calm as ever, explains that her discontent isn't from sadness, but from a desire to make life more beautiful, not just for herself, but for everyone. Tension simmers beneath their words, Will's longing for Dorothea, Dorothea's quiet loyalty to her husband, all tangled in unspoken emotions. Before Will leaves, Dorothea makes one request, that he never speak ill of Mr. Casaubon's work again. Will, reddening but unable to refuse her, agrees. As he departs, he crosses paths with Mr. Casaubon, whose cold, dismissive farewell only deepens the invisible thread of jealousy between the two men. If you're still listening, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support helps bring more gentle stories your way. That evening, Dorothea tells her husband about Will's decision to leave Rome and become independent. But Mr. Casaubon, distant and indifferent, brushes it aside. And so the three of them stand at a delicate crossroads, Dorothea's steadfast devotion, Will's silent yearning, and Mr. Casaubon's growing suspicion, each caught in a web of emotions none dare to fully acknowledge. Mr. and Mrs. Casaubon return to Lowick Manor after their wedding journey in January, greeted by a cold, snowy landscape. The house feels smaller, quieter, and so does Dorothea's heart. She once thought marriage would bring her purpose, a shared mission with her husband, but now, surrounded by silence and routine, she feels lost. Her dreams of being an active, devoted wife seem distant. Even the once grand room feels lifeless, the books unread, the furniture shrunken. The only thing that stirs her is a small portrait of Mr. Casaubon's aunt, Julia, a woman whose unfortunate marriage now seems strangely relatable. For a moment, Dorothea feels a silent bond with this long-dead woman, wondering if Julia also discovered too late that marriage wasn't what she expected. Hoping to shake off her sadness, Dorothea rushes to find her husband, but she's stopped by her sister Celia and their uncle, Mr. Brooke. Celia, ever calm and gentle, reveals her big news. She's engaged to Sir James Chetham. Though Dorothea once wished for this match, hearing it now feels different, more serious. Celia, however, is practical as always. She doesn't want to marry too soon, saying she likes being engaged. There's no rush since they'll be married all their lives after. Despite her own quiet struggles, Dorothea congratulates Celia warmly, saying Sir James is a good man. Celia, blushing, mentions that he's continuing work on the cottages, a project Dorothea once pushed for, and says Sir James will share the progress when he visits. With a playful smile, Celia teases Dorothea about becoming too learned, as if Mr. Casaubon's studious nature might have already rubbed off on her. The chapter closes with a quiet contrast. Celia's simple, hopeful engagement set against Dorothea's growing sense of unease. One sister stepping into marriage with lightness, the other weighed down by unexpected doubts. Time drifts softly through Lowick Manor, and the quiet weight of Dorothea's marriage to Mr. Casaubon settles like a gentle mist. Once she had imagined a life of purpose, standing beside a brilliant man, helping him with his great work. But now the days feel long, the silence between them growing wider with each passing hour. Mr. Casaubon, lost in the corridors of his own mind, had never married for love. To him, a young, obedient wife was a sensible choice, someone to assist with his scholarly ambitions, to sit quietly by his side as he worked. Then a letter arrives from Will Ladislaw, his young cousin. Will asks to visit Lowick, but Mr. Casaubon, wary of the young man's carefree spirit, refuses. Without reason, he accuses Dorothea of wanting Will to come, of thinking of her own wishes, not his. The words land like a cold wind. Dorothea, stunned and wounded, speaks back, her voice usually soft, carrying a rare sharpness. A small moment, but one that cracks the delicate peace between them. And then a sudden stillness. Mr. Casaubon gasps for breath, his body trembling, and in an instant the argument dissolves. Dorothea rushes to him, fear pushing aside her hurt. Sir James Chetham soon arrives, his concern quiet but firm. He suggests calling the young doctor Mr. Lydgate. Too weak to protest, Mr. Casaubon nods. As night gently falls over Lowick Manor, Dorothea sits at her husband's side, the silence between them now heavier than ever. Time drifts softly at Lowick Manor. The days pass in quiet stillness as Mr. Casaubon slowly recovers from his illness. Though his strength seems to return, Dr. Lydgate gently warns Dorothea. Her husband's health is fragile, his heart strained. He must avoid overwork, avoid worry. But how to ease a mind like Mr. Casaubon's feels like an impossible task. Dorothea listens carefully, but a shadow lingers in her heart. Lydgate speaks softly of possibilities, that with care Mr. Casaubon may live for many years, yet there is also the silent chance that his life could end suddenly. The thought presses against Dorothea's mind, a quiet ache she carries alone. Then another ripple in the stillness. Another letter arrives from Will Ladislaw. He writes to Mr. Casaubon, announcing his plans to return to England, hoping to visit Lowick. Mr. Casaubon, however, refuses the visit. Still suspicious of Will's interest in Dorothea, not wanting to upset her husband, Dorothea agrees the visit must be stopped. She asks her uncle, Mr. Brooke, to write to Will, gently explaining that Mr. Casaubon's health will not allow for guests. But Mr. Brooke, ever lost in his own thoughts, adds an unexpected twist. Without telling Dorothea, he invites Will to Tipton Grange instead. And so, as the night settles over Lowick Manor, Dorothea sits quietly by her husband's side, watching over his fragile health, unaware that far beyond the stillness of their home, Will Ladislaw is already being drawn back into their world. Mr. Brooke, in his usual offhand manner, casually mentions that Will Ladislaw has arrived and is staying with him. His words drift through the air, light and careless, but they land with an unexpected weight. Dorothea's heart stirs, just for a moment, an involuntary spark of surprise. She quickly composes herself, yet something unspoken lingers in the space between her and her husband. Mr. Casaubon, ever composed, acknowledges the news with a quiet, formal politeness. But beneath the surface, something colder brews, a silent flicker of irritation, carefully masked by his scholarly demeanour. And so Will Ladislaw's presence ripples through their lives once more. Though Will once felt indebted to Mr. Casaubon for his support, time has eroded that gratitude, replacing it with a quiet bitterness. When he looks at Dorothea now, he doesn't see the wife of an aging, learned man. He sees a woman full of light, too bright, too eager to serve, a spirit meant to soar, yet bound by duty and quiet restraint. To Will, Mr. Casaubon's marriage to Dorothea feels like a cruel mistake, a delicate flame smothered beneath the weight of dusty books and unspoken disappointments. Yet Will keeps these feelings hidden, tucked behind polite smiles and stolen glances. And then, one rainy morning, fate seems to conspire in Will's favour. He pretends to be sketching in the gardens at Lowick, knowing Dorothea often takes a morning walk. But the sky darkens without warning, and the rain falls, soft at first, then steady, driving Will indoors. Now, in the quiet of the library, they stand face to face, just the two of them. The room is still, the rain tapping gently at the windows. Their conversation begins softly, like a secret shared in the hush of night. Dorothea speaks of her wish to help her husband, to lighten his burdens, to be useful. But beneath her words, there's a sadness she doesn't name, a silent ache, like a flower wilting in the dark. Will listens, his heart tightening. He longs to tell her she deserves more, a life not hidden in the shadows of someone else's work, but he says nothing. He simply offers gentle suggestions, his voice steady, his thoughts anything but. And then, as if testing the air between them, Will reveals something unexpected. Mr. Brooke has offered him a job, running the Pioneer newspaper, which would keep him in Middlemarch. Dorothea, without hesitation, says she would like him to stay. The words are simple, honest, but they hang in the air between them, heavy with meaning. A quiet confession, too bold for daylight. Realizing what she has just said, Dorothea's cheeks flush. She quickly adds that Mr. Casaubon should be consulted first. Will understands. They are both walking a delicate line. He leaves hurriedly, the rain easing to a drizzle as he vanishes into the fields, away from the looming shadow of Mr. Casaubon. Later that day, when Mr. Casaubon returns home, the sky is dim, the light fading. Dorothea mentions Will's new job, hoping for her husband's thoughts, but Casaubon says nothing. His silence is a storm of its own. He doesn't argue, he doesn't ask questions, but his mind, Oh, his mind is a thundercloud, swirling with dark conclusions and quiet jealousy. That night, as Dorothea sleeps, Mr. Casaubon sits alone, his pen moving across the page in slow, deliberate strokes. He writes a letter to Will. The words are cold, formal, each sentence brimming with resentment too subtle to name. He tells Will that accepting the job would be offensive, that his presence in Middlemarch, so near to Dorothea, would not be welcome. And with one final stroke of the pen, Mr. Casaubon warns Will that should he choose to stay, he will no longer be received at Lowick. The letter is sealed, the candle burns low, and the night presses on, quiet, unyielding. The air at Lowick Manor seemed heavier than usual, filled with thoughts unspoken and emotions tightly held. Dorothea found herself drifting deeper into concern for Will Ladislaw. Their recent conversation lingered in her mind, stirring a new resolve within her. She thought about his family's misfortunes, the injustice done to his grandmother, Aunt Julia, disinherited simply for marrying a poor man. To Dorothea, this was more than an old story. It was a wrong still waiting to be made right. Alone in her quiet boudoir, where the pale light filtered through the windows and the delicate miniatures on the walls seemed to watch her, Dorothea pondered over her husband's will. It troubled her to think that so much of Mr. Casaubon's wealth would fall to her, while Will, who had been wronged by the family's past, was left with nothing. In her heart she decided it must be changed. Surely her husband, so devoted to justice and learning, would agree, but Mr. Casaubon, that same day, had sent a letter to Will Ladislaw, a letter not of justice, but of cold rejection. He made it clear that Will's presence in Middlemarch, especially so close to Dorothea, was offensive. If Will accepted Mr. Brooke's offer to run the Pioneer, he would no longer be welcome at Lowick. That night Dorothea lay awake, her thoughts racing. When she heard Mr. Casaubon stir, she lit a candle and softly asked if she might speak to him. She explained her idea, that Will should be provided for, that the unfairness of the past must be corrected, but her words, meant with pure intention, only struck a nerve. Mr. Casaubon's reply was sharp, more biting than Dorothea had ever heard. He accused her of overstepping, of meddling in matters beyond her understanding. Worse still, he implied that Will had influenced her, planting ideas against him. Dorothea, stunned by his sudden anger, fell silent. The night stretched on, both of them lying awake, a painful quiet resting between them. The next day Will's response to Mr. Casaubon arrived. It was firm but respectful, making it clear that while he appreciated the help given to him in the past, he would not let it dictate his future. He saw no reason why taking the job at the Pioneer should offend Mr. Casaubon or affect his standing in any way. Will was determined to live freely, unbound by the older man's silent expectations. Reading the letter, Mr. Casaubon felt his worst fears confirmed. In his eyes, Will was no longer a grateful young man. He was a threat. He believed Will's sudden desire to stay in Middlemarch had only one hidden motive, Dorothea. Though Mr. Casaubon never doubted his wife's loyalty, it was painfully clear to him that she had a softness for Will's words, a readiness to see him in a kinder light. Now Mr. Casaubon found himself trapped, not only by his jealousy, but by his own pride. He couldn't ask Mr. Brooke to dismiss Will without revealing his fear. He couldn't confide in Sir James Chetham, without risking gossip about his marriage. So he chose silence, a bitter, brooding silence. He had forbidden Will from coming to Lowick, but in his heart he was already preparing more ways to keep him and Dorothea apart. And so the tension in the old manor grew thicker, like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. Sir James Chetham grows uneasy about Mr. Brooke's sudden political ambitions, especially his plan to run for Parliament and his ownership of the Pioneer newspaper. Over lunch with the Cadwalladers, they discuss how the Trumpet, a rival paper, mocks Brooke, calling him a landlord who preaches reform while neglecting his own tenants. Worse still, Will Ladislaw, once a mere guest at the Hall and a distant relation of Mr. Casaubon, has now taken on the role of the Pioneer's editor, adding a certain flair and unpredictability to Brooke's campaign. Sir James suggests bringing Caleb Garth back to manage Brooke's estate, hoping it will fix the damage caused by years of poor management. But the real challenge is convincing Brooke without offending his pride. Sir James Chetham arranges for Dorothea to visit her uncle, Mr. Brooke, alone, hoping she might influence him to improve the management of his estate. At the Grange, Dorothea speaks passionately about the poor living conditions of Brooke's tenants, urging him to make real changes before standing for Parliament. Will Ladislaw, present during the conversation, is struck again by Dorothea's intensity and goodness, but also feels a painful distance, admiring her but sensing how unreachable she seems. Their private moment comes when Mr. Brooke leaves to deal with a tenant's son caught poaching. Will tells Dorothea that Mr. Casaubon has forbidden him from visiting Lowick Manor, clearly hurt by the older man's jealousy. Dorothea, shocked and saddened, reassures Will that she will still hear of him through her uncle's work. Their conversation turns thoughtful and personal. Dorothea speaks of her simple life, her belief in doing good, and the comfort she finds in seeking light against darkness. Will, deeply moved, confesses his own rebellious spirit. Meanwhile, Brooke's encounter with Dagley, the drunken and angry tenant, turns chaotic. Dagley openly insults Brooke, ranting about reform and the injustice of landlords, forcing Brooke into a rare, awkward retreat. For the first time, Brooke realizes that his tenants may not see him as the benevolent landlord he imagines himself to be. Mr. Casaubon, weighed down by both his intellectual failures and his growing jealousy of Will Ladislaw, calls upon Lydgate to inquire about the seriousness of his illness. Though he has never openly discussed his health with Dorothea, his recent preoccupation with death drives him to seek clarity. His thoughts reveal an increasing bitterness, not only about his own mortality, but also about Dorothea's perceived attachment to Will, which he imagines as a looming betrayal. Lydgate, sensing Casaubon's desire for honesty, delivers a direct but cautious diagnosis. Casaubon suffers from fatty degeneration of the heart, a condition that could result in sudden death, though it might also allow him to live comfortably for many years. Casaubon absorbs the news with a composed exterior, though inwardly the realization of his vulnerability shakes him. He pointedly asks if Lydgate has shared this information with Dorothea, to which Lydgate admits he has only mentioned the possibilities. Casaubon ends the conversation abruptly, his mind spiraling further into paranoid visions of Dorothea's future without him, fearing that Will, whom he views as both an opportunist and a threat, will swoop in to claim her and his wealth once he is gone. Meanwhile, Dorothea, aware that Lydgate has come but uncertain about the details, waits anxiously. She longs to comfort her husband, yet she dreads his rejection, as their relationship has become strained by his coldness and her inability to reach him emotionally. When she approaches him in the garden, offering a tender, silent gesture of support by slipping her arm through his, Casaubon's unyielding posture and lack of response feel like a painful blow to Dorothea's already bruised heart. His silent retreat into the library, leaving her alone, ignites a rare moment of anger and rebellion in Dorothea. For the first time, she lets her resentment surface, thinking bitterly about how misunderstood and undervalued she feels in their marriage. She questions why she should continue to suppress her emotions for a man who neither acknowledges nor appreciates her sacrifices. In her fury, she resolves not to join him for dinner, allowing herself to sit alone in her room, both physically and emotionally distanced from her husband. However, Dorothea's anger softens as the evening deepens. Her natural compassion reawakens as she reflects on the suffering Casaubon must be experiencing, especially after what she assumes was troubling news from Lydgate. Her indignation gives way to pity, and she realizes that his distant, unkind behavior likely stems from his own internal anguish. Determined to rise above her resentment, she waits for him in the hallway, hoping to offer a silent gesture of reconciliation. When Casaubon sees her standing in the dark corridor, he is surprised but touched. In a rare moment of tenderness, he gently suggests that she need not extend her life by watching over him. This brief flicker of kindness breaks Dorothea's emotional walls, and as they walk hand in hand back to their room, the silent tension between them seems momentarily eased. Dorothea Casaubon, usually by her husband's side, decides to venture into town alone. It's a rare outing, but she carries a quiet urgency in her heart. She wants to speak with Dr. Lydgate, not for herself, but for her husband, Mr. Casaubon. Lately, she's noticed a change in him, a new way of organizing his work, a hidden heaviness in his presence, and she's worried he might be keeping something about his health from her. She hopes Lydgate can tell her the truth, even if her husband won't. But when she arrives at Lydgate's home, he isn't there. Instead, she meets Rosamond, Lydgate's wife, a vision of grace and beauty. Dorothea, simple in her white dress, and Rosamond, elegant and fashionable, are a quiet contrast. Both tall, both striking in their own ways. There's also someone else in the room. Will Ladislaw. Dorothea didn't expect to see him there, and when their eyes meet, there's a flicker of surprise. Will offers to fetch Lydgate, but Dorothea quickly decides she'll go to the hospital herself. She doesn't say much to Will, and the silence between them feels heavier than usual. In the carriage, on her way to the hospital, Dorothea's thoughts swirl. She wonders why she felt so uncomfortable seeing Will at Rosamond's home, why there was a strange sense of something unspoken between them. She tells herself it's nothing. After all, Will is her husband's cousin, but the feeling lingers. Meanwhile, back at the house, Will is left unsettled. He realizes Dorothea seemed distant, as though for the first time there was a wall between them. He wonders if Mr. Casaubon has planted seeds of doubt in her mind, if her husband has told her he is beneath her somehow. Rosamond, watching Will, is curious too. She playfully suggests that Will might be a little too devoted to Dorothea, teasing him about his admiration. Will brushes it off, but the sting of Dorothea's sudden coldness stays with him. Later, when Lydgate returns home, Rosamond casually mentions Will's visit and Mrs. Casaubon's unexpected appearance. She wonders if Will was embarrassed to be seen at their house, but Lydgate dismisses the idea. Will is carefree, a bit of a wanderer. Rosamond, though, has her own quiet thoughts. She's beginning to realize something she hadn't truly understood before, that even after marriage, women can still hold power over men's hearts, that a glance, a word can stir feelings, and that being admired is its own kind of quiet triumph. But for now, the day fades into evening. Dorothea, Will, Rosamond, and Lydgate all move through their own small moments, silent thoughts, hidden hopes, each of them carrying unspoken emotions like delicate glass, fragile yet unbroken. Dorothea found Dr. Lydgate at the new hospital in Middlemarch. She had come to speak with him, worried about her husband, Mr. Casaubon, wondering if his health had worsened, if there was something he wasn't telling her. Lydgate reassures her that physically Mr. Casaubon is the same, but there's a new anxiety in him, a worry about his own illness, that seems to weigh him down more than before. Dorothea, thoughtful and concerned, wonders if something she said or did might have stirred this fear in her husband's mind. As they walk, Lydgate takes the chance to speak about something close to his heart, the new hospital. It's a project he's deeply invested in, yet it's facing opposition from many in the town, simply because the hospital is backed by Mr. Bulstrode, a man with an unpopular reputation. Lydgate explains that some of the townspeople, and even other doctors, are against the hospital, not because they truly dislike the idea of helping the sick, but because they resent Bulstrode's involvement, and perhaps even Lydgate's role as the hospital's chosen doctor. Dorothea listens intently. She's captivated by Lydgate's passion for his work, the way he speaks about improving medical practices, helping the poor, and making lasting changes. It touches something deep within her, that same longing she has to do good in the world. She confesses to Lydgate that since her marriage, she feels like her desire to help others has slipped away. Her life now centered around Mr. Casaubon and his scholarly work. But here, standing in the hospital gardens, that old spark reignites. Without hesitation, Dorothea offers to donate £200 a year to support the hospital. It's a simple, heartfelt gesture, one that surprises Lydgate but fills him with hope. When Dorothea returns home, she tells her husband about her plan. Mr. Casaubon, distant as ever, doesn't object. He rarely cares about money, yet in his silence there's something darker, a growing distrust of Dorothea. He suspects that her meeting with Lydgate wasn't just about charity. He believes she was seeking to learn what Lydgate knows about his own health, something Casaubon has been desperate to keep hidden from her, and so the quiet distance between them grows, like a shadow, stretching longer as the sun sets. Dorothea, full of good intentions and a longing to do what's right, and Mr. Casaubon, lost in his own insecurities, feeling more alone than ever. As the night deepens over Middlemarch, Dorothea's heart is stirred by new purpose, while her husband's heart, fragile and fearful, remains a world apart. In the quiet town of Middlemarch, change was stirring, and not everyone welcomed it. Dr. Lydgate, a young physician with new ideas, found himself at the centre of growing tension. His plans for the new fever hospital, supported by Mr. Bulstrode, aimed to modernise medicine, but his methods clashed with the town's older doctors, who saw his reforms as a threat. Rumours spread quickly. At the Tankard in Slaughter Lane, Mrs. Dollop claimed Lydgate would let people die in the hospital or cut them open after death, and her listeners, already wary of change, believed her. Even Mr. Malmsey, a grocer and father, felt uneasy when Lydgate criticised the overuse of medicine. To him, a doctor's bill should come with bottles and powders, something real, something you could see. Despite the gossip, Lydgate's treatments succeeded. Nancy Nash, once thought to have a tumour, recovered under his care, though the town still whispered of a miraculous cure. Mr. Borthrop Trumbull, the proud auctioneer, overcame pneumonia with Lydgate's expectant method and spoke highly of the doctor's skill, yet every success deepened the resentment of his peers. Dr. Sprague, Dr. Minchin, and Mr. Wrench saw Lydgate as arrogant, too close to Bulstrode, and too eager to disrupt tradition. The word charlatan began to circulate, a quiet accusation growing louder with each passing day. At home, Lydgate tried to push the hostility aside, his mind fixed on his work and the great medical pioneers like Vesalius, who had once challenged old beliefs. Rosamond, his wife, could not share his passion, wishing he had chosen a less grim profession. But Lydgate, though surrounded by doubt and distrust, held firm. He believed in his purpose, his science, and the future he was determined to build. In Middlemarch, while Dr. Lydgate fought for medical reform, the town itself buzzed with a different kind of struggle, the push for political change. The air was thick with talk of reform bills and elections, and the Pioneer, the newspaper now guided by Will Ladislaw, became a platform for these debates. Will, ever passionate and quick-witted, worked closely with Mr. Brooke, urging him to embrace the cause of reform, though Brooke wavered, wishing to appear progressive without truly upsetting the balance of tradition. Will's fiery speeches drew both praise and criticism, earning him a reputation as bold and unsteady. Some in Middlemarch whispered that he was a dangerous radical, while others admired his passion. Though Will felt a sense of purpose in his work, his heart remained restless. His connection to Dorothea, distant yet ever present, lingered in his thoughts. Still, he found comfort in the company of friends. He became a familiar presence at Lydgate's home, often lounging on the rug, talking politics with the doctor, and sharing music with Rosamond. Rosamond, delicate and graceful, found herself both intrigued and annoyed by Will. He was not like her husband. His moods were playful, his words sometimes sharp, but his presence filled the quiet gaps left by Lydgate's growing preoccupation with his work and financial worries. One evening, a small spark of tension flared between Lydgate and Will. Their discussion of reform turned into a clash of pride, Lydgate defending his alliance with Mr. Bulstrode for the sake of medical progress, and Will insisting his loyalty to Mr. Brooke was just as free of personal gain. The disagreement was brief but charged, and Rosamond, sensing the shift in the air, softly urged the men back to music and calm. Later that night, Rosamond gently asked Lydgate what had troubled him before Will arrived. Though burdened by unpaid bills and the weight of his ambitions, Lydgate only smiled, hiding his concerns from his wife, wanting to protect her from worry. And so the evening settled into quiet once more, the tension fading like a ripple in still water, as the world of Middlemarch moved forward, caught between hope for reform and the familiar comfort of old ways. On a quiet Saturday evening, Will Ladislaw found himself restless, his mind circling the same thoughts. His argument with Lydgate had stirred an old discomfort, the feeling that perhaps he had made a mistake by tying himself to Mr. Brooke and the cause of political reform in Middlemarch. Was he foolish for staying, for fighting a battle that felt both aimless and impossible? Yet beneath these questions Will knew the real reason he remained. It was Dorothea. Though he never let his mind wander into vulgar hopes of Mr. Casaubon's death or dreams of Dorothea as a widow, his heart clung to the quiet joy of simply being near her. The thought of her, her grace, her mind, her voice, was a kind of treasure, a feeling so pure he dared not wish for anything more. She was in his heart forever beyond reach, yet always present. To love her, even from afar, felt like an inheritance of the soul. That night, as sleep eluded him, Will resolved to see her again. It was Sunday the next day, and he would go to Lowick Church. Surely, he told himself, it was not a crime to visit a country church on a spring morning. The walk to Lowick was bathed in gentle light, moss glowing green beneath budding trees, the sky soft and clear. Will felt a quiet happiness, imagining Dorothea's presence, letting his thoughts drift like a melody. But when he arrived, his heart faltered. Dorothea did come, her white bonnet and grey cloak familiar, her expression calm but distant. She bowed to him, and Will, suddenly self-conscious, found himself unable to meet her gaze again. Mr. Casaubon, stern and silent, entered the pew beside her, and Will's earlier boldness dissolved into regret. The service stretched unbearably long. He had hoped to glimpse Dorothea's warmth, but now, with Mr. Casaubon so near, he felt foolish for coming. When the congregation finally rose, Dorothea gave him another brief bow, but this time her face showed a flicker of emotion, a tremor that hinted at repressed tears. Will watched helplessly as she and her husband left the churchyard without a backward glance. He could not follow, could not speak to her, and so the same road he had walked that morning, full of hope, now felt heavier beneath his feet. The spring light seemed dimmer, the air less sweet. The world around him was unchanged, yet Will felt the quiet ache of longing and the sharp sting of distance, the painful beauty of loving someone who remained just beyond his grasp. Dorothea lay awake, while her husband, Mr. Casaubon, slept beside her. Though her body was still, her mind was a battlefield, torn between the duty she felt towards her husband's work and the dread of a future spent sifting through his lifeless research. She knew now that his great key to all mythologies was a hollow pursuit, built on uncertain theories and unproven ideas. And yet she also saw how much he depended on her, not just for companionship, but as the last hope that his work might survive him. When morning came, Dorothea, pale and exhausted, found herself unable to refuse him. She resolved to give him the promise he sought, to carry on his work after his death, not out of belief in his ideas, but out of pity for his failing spirit. Mr. Casaubon, unwell from the strain of the previous day, told Dorothea he would walk in the garden. She asked for more time, saying she would join him in the yew tree walk. Left alone, Dorothea accepted her fate. She would say yes. It felt like a doom she could not escape, a promise born not of duty to his work, but of compassion for the man. When she finally went to meet him, she found Mr. Casaubon seated in the summer house, his head resting on his arms. At first she thought he was asleep, worn out from the night's turmoil. Gently she touched his shoulder and spoke softly, telling him she was ready to give him the answer he wanted. But he did not respond. Her heart quickened. She called his name again, still nothing. Fear rushed through her as she removed his cap, leaned in close, and pleaded for him to wake. He never would. The silence in his ears was eternal. In the quiet, yet tense library of Lowick Grange, Sir James Chetham stands, his frustration barely concealed, as he discusses a pressing matter with Mr. Brooke, the aftermath of Mr. Casaubon's death and the scandalous codicil to his will. The codicil implies that if Dorothea were to marry Will Ladislaw, she would lose her inheritance. A cruel move, stirring rumours, and linking Dorothea's name to Ladislaw in a most undignified way. Sir James, protective of Dorothea's honour, insists she must be shielded from further disgrace. His solution: keep business away from her while she mourns, then swiftly move her to Freshitt Hall, with Celia and the baby. But most importantly, get rid of Ladislaw. He pushes Mr. Brooke to send Will away, suggesting they secure him a post abroad, anything to remove him from Dorothea's orbit. But Mr. Brooke, ever the mild-mannered, indecisive gentleman, hesitates. Dismissing Ladislaw, after all, would look suspicious, as if they didn't trust Dorothea. Besides, Ladislaw is useful to Mr. Brooke's political ambitions. With an upcoming election looming, Brooke would rather keep Will close. He's a talented speaker, a valuable ally, and a man with ideas. The discussion grows heated, with Sir James accusing Casaubon of being both petty and ungentlemanly. He doesn't buy Mr. Brooke's attempt to brush the codicil off as just another of Casaubon's oddities. To Sir James, it's clear Casaubon was jealous of Ladislaw, and the world will gossip that Dorothea gave him reason to be. Finally, realizing Mr. Brooke won't budge, Sir James grabs his hat, his parting words firm. He won't stand by and let Dorothea be sacrificed again. He'll do what he can to protect her, whether Mr. Brooke helps or not. And so, while Mr. Brooke nods along, satisfied he's won the argument without taking any real action, the storm surrounding Dorothea and Will Ladislaw continues to brew. In the aftermath of Mr. Casaubon's death, Dorothea finds herself caught between grief, duty, and a growing sense of disillusionment. She remains at Freshitt with Celia, seeking comfort in distance from Lowick, yet aware of the unresolved matters tied to her late husband's estate. When Dorothea expresses a wish to visit Lowick to sort through Casaubon's papers, Sir James and Celia worry for her health, but Lydgate, recognizing Dorothea's need for purpose, advises that she should be allowed to follow her own judgment. At Lowick, Dorothea searches Casaubon's desk, hoping for some personal note or final message, but finds only the cold remnants of his work, including the synoptical tabulation meant to guide her in completing his unfinished research. The silence surrounding Casaubon's last bitter act, The codicil disinheriting Dorothea if she marries Will Ladislaw feels all the heavier. She struggles with conflicting emotions, a desire to do what's right, including her wish to help Will financially, and the horror of appearing to defy Casaubon's will in a way that might seem triumphant rather than just. Meanwhile, Lydgate reopens the matter of the Lowick living, urging Dorothea to consider giving it to Mr. Fairbrother, a kind and capable clergyman weighed down by financial struggles. Dorothea, drawn to those who have suffered or fallen short of their potential, becomes increasingly interested in Fairbrother's situation, especially when Lydgate contrasts him with Mr. Tyke, the more apostolic yet less compassionate candidate favoured by others. Amid these discussions, Lydgate innocently mentions Will Ladislaw's connection to Fairbrother's family, stirring Dorothea's thoughts once again. Though unspoken, the question lingers: what would Will think of Casaubon's cruel condition? Dorothea's world remains entangled in past loyalties and future uncertainties, as the shadow of Will Ladislaw hovers over her every decision. Brooke's campaign, if it could be called such without stretching the definition, had descended into an absurd spectacle. Mr. Brooke, caught up in his speech, faces unexpected ridicule when a ventriloquist mimics him, and an effigy of him appears in the crowd. The mockery escalates with laughter, jeers, and eggs, hurled at both the effigy and Brooke himself. Flustered and unable to regain control, he retreats to the committee room, insisting things will improve at his nomination, though his supporters seem doubtful. Will Ladislaw, frustrated with his position as Brooke's assistant, dreams of leaving Middlemarch to build a political career that would earn Dorothea's respect. However, he delays his departure, hoping for a sign from her. Meanwhile, Brooke decides to withdraw from the election, passing his campaign machinery to another candidate. He hints that Will should also step away, revealing that others have suggested taking the Pioneer newspaper out of his hands. Feeling insulted but determined, Will resolves to stay, not for Brooke, but to assert his independence and resist being pushed out by Brooke's family. Dorothea sits alone, lost in thought, when her maid, Tantrip, interrupts her to say that Mr. Will Ladislaw is downstairs, asking to see her. Dorothea agrees to meet him, and they go to the drawing room, a neutral space, not tied to memories of her late husband. Will has come to say goodbye. He plans to leave for London to pursue a career as a barrister, hoping to build a name for himself through hard work, since he has neither family wealth nor status. Dorothea encourages him, admiring his ambition and his desire to help others through political work. She speaks warmly of his talents, reminding him how people praise his public speaking and his sense of justice. Though the conversation starts formally, it quickly becomes charged with unspoken feelings. Will, trying to mask his pain, asks if Dorothea approves of his plan to stay away for years until he has achieved something worthy. Dorothea, struggling with her own emotions, quietly agrees, even though the thought of him being gone for so long saddens her. She looks out the window at the rose bushes, reflecting on the time that will pass in his absence. Will, feeling a growing distance between them, bitterly remarks that he will never hear from her and that she will forget him. Dorothea assures him that she never forgets anyone she has cared for. Her life, after all, has never been too full of people or distractions. As their emotions rise, Dorothea offers Will a miniature portrait of his grandmother, a family keepsake. But Will, frustrated, refuses it, saying he has no room for sentimental objects. His only possessions are in his suitcase. Dorothea, hurt by his reaction, comments that he is luckier than her. Having nothing means he has nothing to weigh him down. Will, struck by her words, admits that poverty has never felt like a curse until now, because it now seems to stand between him and what he truly cares for. Their intense conversation is suddenly interrupted when Sir James Chetham arrives. His presence adds another layer of tension, as he clearly disapproves of Will. Dorothea, however, remains calm and composed, bidding Will a kind but formal goodbye. The meeting ends with both Dorothea and Will feeling a painful distance between them, a distance made greater by pride, misunderstanding, and the silent weight of their unspoken love. Sir James, though polite, further solidifies the barrier between Dorothea and Will by his mere presence, a reminder of the social and personal obstacles that stand in their way. As Will leaves, Dorothea is left with a quiet ache in her heart, and the sense that something precious has slipped further from her grasp. Dorothea, still dressed in mourning for her late husband, feels a quiet sadness. She believes her connection with Will Ladislaw is over. He's gone, and if he returns, he'll be a different man. While visiting her sister Celia, Dorothea joins a small gathering where the conversation drifts to remarriage. When Celia gently removes Dorothea's widow's cap, revealing her dark hair, it feels like a glimpse of the old Dorothea, strong and thoughtful. When others hint at her marrying again, Dorothea softly but firmly dismisses the idea. Later, she tells Celia she has no plans to remarry. Instead, she dreams of building a community where people work together, a life filled with purpose. In Middlemarch, a quiet distance grew between Rosamond and Lydgate. Their life, once full of dreams, now strained under silent struggles of money, pride, and unspoken resentment. Rosamond, graceful and composed, found pride in her refined tastes and her connection to Captain Lydgate, a baronet's son. Despite Lydgate's disapproval, she chose to ride with the captain, leading to a tragic accident that caused the loss of their unborn child. Yet Rosamond calmly insisted the accident had nothing to do with it, unwavering in her belief, but deeper than their grief was the weight of debt. Lydgate, once ambitious and proud, was now overwhelmed by unpaid bills and falling income. One evening he finally confessed their financial troubles to Rosamond, explaining they must offer their possessions, even her jewellery, as security. Rosamond's response was distant. "What can I do?" she asked softly, her voice cool and detached. When Lydgate mentioned returning her jewels, she silently fetched the box, placing it before him with calm finality. She would not stay home to witness the humiliation of their belongings being inventoried. Hurt by her coldness, Lydgate pleaded with her not to leave him alone in their struggle. At last, Rosamond agreed to stay. A kiss was shared, faint and distant, yet the chasm between them only deepened. In Middlemarch, news travelled like pollen, drifting carelessly from one person to another. It was through such whispers that Rosamond learned of a secret, a cruel clause in Mr. Casaubon's will, stating that if his widow Dorothea were to marry Will Ladislaw, she would lose her inheritance. Rosamond, ever composed and graceful, couldn't resist sharing this with Will the next time he visited, lightly teasing him about the romance of it all, but her words struck Will like a sudden storm. His usual charm vanished, replaced by a harsh, shaken voice. "It is a foul insult," he muttered, not just to himself, but to Dorothea. Rosamond, unmoved by his reaction, smiled playfully, suggesting she expected to hear of their marriage one day. But Will, fierce and certain, declared, "Never," before abruptly leaving. Left alone, Rosamond wandered to the window, a wave of quiet dissatisfaction settling over her. Life felt dull. The family at Quallingham ignored her, and her husband Lydgate would likely scold her again about money. She had already defied him, secretly asking her father for help, only to be told, "I am more likely to want help myself." In Middlemarch, an auction at Mr. Larcher's house drew a curious crowd. Will Ladislaw attended to bid on a painting for Mrs. Bulstrode, winning it for 10 guineas. Amidst the commotion, a stranger named Mr. Raffles approached Will, revealing unsettling details about his mother, Sarah Dunkirk, and her escape from a family with a shady past. Later, as Will walked alone under the starlit sky, he wrestled with the weight of these revelations. Though his mother's secrets could fuel others' suspicions, Will held firm. His heart and character remained untainted, no matter what others believed. In Middlemarch, the past has a way of creeping back into the present, no matter how deeply it's been buried. Mr. Bulstrode, a man now known for his piety and wealth, finds himself haunted by old secrets, secrets tied to the fortune he built and the people he wronged along the way. It begins when Mr. Raffles, an old associate, arrives unexpectedly, stirring a deep sense of dread in Bulstrode. Raffles knows too much about the questionable business practices Bulstrode once profited from, about a hidden daughter named Sarah Dunkirk, and about how Bulstrode kept Sarah's existence a secret to secure his own fortune through marriage. Though Bulstrode has spent years convincing himself that his actions served a higher purpose, the fear of exposure now looms over him like a dark cloud. Desperate to ease his conscience and perhaps shield himself from scandal, Bulstrode seeks out Will Ladislaw. He reveals the startling connection between them. Will's mother, Sarah Dunkirk, was the very daughter whose existence Bulstrode concealed. The fortune that once might have gone to Sarah and her family instead flowed into Bulstrode's hands. In an effort to make amends, Bulstrode offers Will financial support, £500 a year for the rest of his life, and a sum of money after his death. It's presented as an act of repentance, a way to right a wrong. But Will's reaction is swift and cutting. Shocked and angry, he refuses the money. To him, accepting it would mean aligning himself with the very dishonour that taints his family's past. His pride and sense of integrity flare, and he makes it clear that he wants nothing to do with Bulstrode's wealth. "You shall keep your ill-gotten money," he says, his voice firm and unyielding. For Will, this moment is about more than money. It's about protecting his own name, his honour, and his connection to Dorothea. To accept Bulstrode's offer would be to carry a stain he could never explain to her, and so he walks away, leaving Bulstrode stunned and humiliated. After Will's departure, Bulstrode is left alone, overcome with emotion. It is the first time someone of Will's standing has openly scorned him, and the weight of it drives him to tears. For years, Bulstrode convinced himself that his actions were justified, that his wealth and influence were tools to serve God's will, but now, faced with the bitter truth, he realizes that his past has not only caught up with him, it threatens to shatter the respectable life he has so carefully built. That night, even as his family returns home, full of talk about an inspiring sermon they've just heard, Bulstrode feels no comfort. His mind races with fear, not just of judgment from God, but from the people of Middlemarch. And though Will is gone, the silence left behind feels heavier than words. The past is no longer a distant shadow, it stands right beside Bulstrode, as real and unforgiving as ever. In Middlemarch, Will Ladislaw, feeling restless and burdened by recent events, longs to see Dorothea one last time before leaving Middlemarch for good. He writes her a letter asking for a final meeting. Meanwhile, Dorothea visits Freshitt and the Grange, unaware of Will's note. There, Sir James and Mrs. Cadwallader, suspicious of Will's lingering presence in Middlemarch, try to subtly warn Dorothea about him, hinting at rumours connecting him with Rosamond Lydgate. But Dorothea fiercely defends Will, her loyalty unwavering despite their efforts to sway her opinion. By chance, Dorothea unexpectedly encounters Will at the Grange. Their meeting is charged with unspoken feelings and painful restraint. Will, hurt by the gossip about him, speaks bitterly about his ruined reputation and the impossibility of any future with Dorothea. He hints at his love for her, without openly confessing it, leaving Dorothea confused and heartbroken. She longs to reassure him of her trust, but fear of saying too much holds her back. As they part, Will's words are distant and cold, and Dorothea, watching him leave, feels a strange sense of joy, realizing for the first time that he loves her, not Rosamond. But that joy is mixed with sorrow, knowing they are bound by circumstances and her late husband's will, making any deeper connection impossible. Later, as her carriage passes Will on the road, they exchange a silent, painful glance, two souls pulled apart by fate. That night, Will leaves Middlemarch, carrying both love and heartache with him. Lydgate is drowning in debt, weighed down by financial stress and the burden of keeping up appearances. He hopes Rosamond will support his plan to sell their house, but she resists, unwilling to accept a humbler life. Though outwardly calm, she secretly works against him, cancelling the sale and writing to his wealthy uncle for help, without telling him. When Lydgate discovers her interference, he is stunned. Frustration builds between them, each feeling unheard and disappointed. Trapped by pride and circumstance, Lydgate contemplates the humiliating step of asking his uncle for money. Their marriage, once hopeful, now feels like a quiet, bitter struggle. Rosamond secretly writes to Sir Godwin for financial help, but his harsh reply humiliates Lydgate. Furious, he accuses her of constant interference and secrecy. Rosamond, calm yet distant, insists she only wanted to prevent misery. Their argument turns bitter until she tearfully wishes she had died with their child. Lydgate, defeated, comforts her, realizing she has quietly won. Though trapped in their struggles, he convinces himself her suffering is greater than his. Lydgate, weighed down by debt and desperation, finds himself gambling at the Green Dragon. What starts as a casual visit turns into reckless betting. He wins at first, but soon begins to lose. Lydgate is ashamed after gambling and losing money, but his deeper worry is his growing debt. With no other options, he considers seeking help from Bulstrode, despite his pride. Days pass, and he hesitates, dreading the humiliation of asking. Then Bulstrode summons him, presenting an unexpected change. He plans to withdraw from hospital funding. However, Mrs. Casaubon may take his place, though she needs time to decide. With this uncertain hope, Lydgate finally speaks of his troubles. He admits his financial struggles and asks for a loan. Bulstrode, instead of helping, coldly suggests bankruptcy. Stunned and humiliated, Lydgate leaves, realizing how truly alone he is in his struggle. Lydgate, weighed down by debt and desperation, finds himself drawn into the dim-lit allure of the Green Dragon. What begins as a casual evening of distraction turns into reckless gambling. At first, luck seems to favour him. Coins clink in his hands, and for a fleeting moment he feels relief. But fortune is fickle. The tide turns, and soon his winnings vanish. Each loss digs deeper, until he walks away with empty pockets and a heavier heart. Ashamed, Lydgate struggles not only with the money he's lost, but with the crushing weight of his debts. He can see no way forward. Swallowing his pride, he considers the one option he has long resisted, asking Bulstrode for help. Days pass as he hesitates, dreading the humiliation of begging for a loan. When he finally forces himself to speak, Bulstrode listens with cold detachment. Then, instead of offering aid, he suggests bankruptcy. Stunned and humiliated, Lydgate leaves the banker's office with a hollow feeling in his chest. He had believed he was desperate before. Now he realizes just how alone he truly is. Meanwhile, Bulstrode's own past comes knocking. The return of Raffles, a man who knows the darkest secrets of his fortune, fills him with dread. Raffles, ill and manipulative, enjoys tormenting the banker, threatening to expose him. Bulstrode, panicked, hides him away at Stone Court, tending to him under the guise of charity. But his charity is laced with fear. When Raffles's condition worsens, Lydgate is called to examine him. The doctor warns Bulstrode against giving him alcohol, prescribing careful treatment. That night, as Bulstrode watches over the sick man, a dark hope stirs in his heart. If Raffles dies, his secrets die with him. The next morning, as Raffles grows weaker, Bulstrode sees an opportunity. Perhaps in an effort to distract from his own guilt, he suddenly offers Lydgate the very money he had refused before. That night, too exhausted to stay by Raffles's side, Bulstrode leaves him in the care of his housekeeper. But before retiring, he hands her the key to the brandy. By morning, Raffles is dead. Lydgate, returning to check on his patient, is startled by the sudden decline. He had not expected this, yet he finds no clear evidence of foul play. The banker remains silent, but secrets never stay buried for long in Middlemarch. At the Green Dragon Inn, rumours swirl like smoke. The town learns that Bulstrode was caring for Raffles before his sudden death. Worse, they discover that Bulstrode gave Lydgate money just afterward. To many, the implication is obvious. Was this a bribe? Did the doctor keep quiet in exchange for clearing his debts? The whispers grow into outrage. At a public meeting, lawyer Mr. Hawley stands and demands that Bulstrode resign from his public positions. The banker, pale and trembling, tries to defend himself, but the room erupts in anger and disgust. In that moment, Lydgate instinctively steps forward to help Bulstrode leave the meeting. It is a simple act of humanity, but to the watching crowd, it is a sign of alliance. The doctor, once respected, is now seen as a man tainted by scandal. News of the accusations reaches Dorothea, who refuses to believe that Lydgate is guilty. With fire in her voice, she declares her determination to uncover the truth and clear his name. But in a town fueled by gossip and suspicion, will the truth even matter? Dorothea is determined to clear Lydgate's name, convinced that he is innocent of taking a bribe from Bulstrode. However, Mr. Fairbrother and Sir James caution her, explaining that the situation is delicate. They argue that approaching Lydgate directly might insult him, and since no official accusations exist, stirring the matter could do more harm than good. Dorothea is frustrated by their hesitance. She passionately insists that people should help their friends in times of trouble, but even her uncle Mr. Brooke advises caution. Determined but disheartened, Dorothea discusses the matter with Celia, who advises her to listen to James and not get involved. Dorothea, torn between her desire to act and the warnings from those around her, struggles with feeling restrained. Meanwhile, Lydgate, crushed by the scandal, flees town for a solitary ride. He is filled with rage and despair, blaming fate and others for his ruined ambitions. He realizes that Middlemarch now sees him as tainted, no matter what he says or does. Even if he proclaims his innocence, few will believe him. The worst part is that even he cannot be entirely sure of Bulstrode's guilt. Did the banker truly interfere in Raffles's treatment, or is it just suspicion? Despite everything, Lydgate refuses to abandon Bulstrode. He knows that distancing himself from the disgraced banker would make his own life easier, but he cannot betray the debt he owes him. However, he also realizes that staying in Middlemarch will be difficult. Patients are already avoiding him, and his reputation is crumbling. Returning home, Lydgate dreads facing Rosamond. He knows the scandal will soon affect them both, but he has no idea how she will react. For now, he chooses silence, waiting for events to force the truth into the open. In Middlemarch, gossip spreads quickly, and soon both Mrs. Bulstrode and Rosamond Lydgate find themselves the subjects of whispered judgments. Though Mrs. Bulstrode is pitied as an innocent wife, Rosamond is criticised for her pride. The town's women debate whether Mrs. Bulstrode should leave her husband now that his past has been exposed. Mrs. Bulstrode, unaware of the full scandal, grows increasingly uneasy. Her husband, Nicholas Bulstrode, has been ill and withdrawn since the disastrous town meeting. Sensing something is deeply wrong, she questions Dr. Lydgate, but he evades her inquiries, unwilling to reveal the painful truth. Determined to learn more, she visits her friends in town, but their vague sympathy only deepens her fears. At last she goes to her brother, Mr. Vincey, who greets her with sorrowful words. "God help you, Harriet, you know all." In that moment she realizes the depth of her husband's disgrace. At first she feels overwhelming shame and betrayal, recalling the years of trust built on deception. But as she absorbs the truth, a stronger feeling takes hold: loyalty. Despite his faults, Bulstrode is still the man she shared her life with, and she cannot abandon him now. Returning home, she isolates herself, preparing for the painful path ahead. She removes her jewelry, puts on a plain black dress, and brushes her hair into a simple bonnet, signaling her acceptance of a new, humbler life. When she finally enters her husband's room, Bulstrode cannot meet her eyes. He fears her rejection, but instead She gently places her hands on him and says, "Look up, Nicholas." Seeing her silent forgiveness, he breaks down in tears. They cry together, not speaking of the scandal, only sharing the burden of disgrace in quiet understanding. In that moment, though all is lost, they are not alone. Rosamond feels a brief relief after Lydgate's debts are paid, but her disappointment in marriage remains. She dreams of a different life, one where Will Ladislaw, not Lydgate, plays the leading role. She imagines Will secretly admires her and regrets his devotion to Dorothea. When Will writes to Lydgate mentioning a possible visit to Middlemarch, Rosamond is delighted. She sees this as a sign that better days are ahead. However, her happiness fades when she unknowingly invites guests to a party, only to have all invitations declined. Lydgate, already overwhelmed by his ruined reputation, is furious. He demands she stop inviting people without consulting him, but she remains silent, feeling trapped in her failing marriage. When Rosamond visits her parents, she finally learns the full scandal surrounding Bulstrode and Lydgate. Shocked and humiliated, she resents her husband even more, believing he has brought shame upon her. Back home, Lydgate senses her coldness, but hopes she will stand by him. Desperate for understanding, Rosamond turns to Will Ladislaw, convinced he will recognize her suffering. The distance between husband and wife grows, with neither able to bridge the widening gap. Lydgate is summoned to Lowick Manor by Dorothea, who wants to discuss the future of the hospital. Bulstrode has informed her that he is leaving Middlemarch and has asked her to take over the funding. She hopes to help Lydgate, believing in his innocence despite the town's suspicions. When Lydgate arrives, Dorothea immediately sees the toll his struggles have taken on him. She expresses her faith in him, insisting that he has done nothing dishonourable. Moved by her trust, Lydgate finally opens up, explaining his financial struggles, his dealings with Bulstrode, and the impossible position he is now in. He acknowledges that while he accepted money from Bulstrode, he never acted unethically as a doctor. However, the town believes otherwise, and his reputation is destroyed. Dorothea urges him to stay and fight for his future, offering financial help. But Lydgate, burdened by Rosamond's desire to leave, feels trapped. He admits that his wife does not understand his struggles and fears she may even believe the rumours. Seeing his pain, Dorothea offers to visit Rosamond and speak with her. Later, Dorothea writes Lydgate a note, enclosing a cheque for £1,000, hoping to free him from Bulstrode's shadow. She plans to deliver it when she visits Rosamond the next day. Rosamond, feeling isolated and hopeful that Will Ladislaw's return might bring change, secretly writes him a letter to hasten his arrival. Meanwhile, Dorothea, determined to support Lydgate, sets out to visit Rosamond, hoping to comfort her and offer friendship. However, when she arrives at Lydgate's home, she unintentionally walks in on a shocking scene. Will and Rosamond sitting close together, Rosamond's face tearful and flushed, while Will clasps her hands and speaks to her with quiet intensity. The sight stuns Dorothea, who, after a brief, composed acknowledgement, leaves without revealing her distress. Outside, she walks briskly to her carriage, her emotions burning with newfound strength. Unlike the pain of her past struggles, which had left her subdued, This betrayal fuels her with scornful energy. Determined to act, she continues with her original plan to visit her uncle and Sir James, defending Lydgate and ensuring support for him. Back at home, her sister Celia notices her unusual intensity, but Dorothea only gives a vague response. She remains focused on her mission, channeling her emotions into action rather than despair. After Dorothea's abrupt departure, Will Ladislaw is left seething with anger, while Rosamond is stunned into silence. She had believed in her power over Will, but his harsh words shatter that illusion. He furiously rejects her, blaming her for ruining his one certainty, Dorothea's belief in him. Rosamond, for the first time, experiences true rejection and is left devastated. Will, consumed by rage and regret, paces around, torn between leaving and the strange pull of responsibility toward Rosamond's misery. When he finally speaks, asking if he should visit Lydgate later, Rosamond, barely audible, agrees. After he leaves, she faints and remains weak until a servant finds her. When Lydgate arrives, Dorothea immediately sees the toll his struggles have taken on him. She expresses her faith in him, insisting that he has done nothing dishonourable. Moved by her trust, Lydgate finally opens up, explaining his financial struggles, his dealings with Bulstrode, and the impossible position he is now in. He acknowledges that while he accepted money from Bulstrode, he never acted unethically as a doctor. However, the town believes otherwise, and his reputation is destroyed. Dorothea urges him to stay and fight for his future, offering financial help. But Lydgate, burdened by Rosamond's desire to leave, feels trapped. He admits that his wife does not understand his struggles and fears she may even believe the rumours. Seeing his pain, Dorothea offers to visit Rosamond and speak with her. Later, Dorothea writes Lydgate a note, enclosing a cheque for £1,000, hoping to free him from Bulstrode's shadow. She plans to deliver it when she visits Rosamond the next day. Rosamond, feeling isolated and hopeful that Will Ladislaw's return might bring change, secretly writes him a letter to hasten his arrival. Meanwhile, Dorothea, determined to support Lydgate, sets out to visit Rosamond, hoping to comfort her and offer friendship. However, when she arrives at Lydgate's home, she unintentionally walks in on a shocking scene. Will and Rosamond sitting close together, Rosamond's face tearful and flushed, while Will clasps her hands and speaks to her with quiet intensity. The sight stuns Dorothea, who, after a brief, composed acknowledgement, leaves without revealing her distress. Outside, she walks briskly to her carriage, her emotions burning with newfound strength. Unlike the pain of her past struggles, which had left her subdued, this betrayal fuels her with scornful energy. Determined to act, she continues with her original plan to visit her uncle and Sir James, defending Lydgate and ensuring support for him. Back at home, her sister Celia notices her unusual intensity, but Dorothea only gives a vague response. She remains focused on her mission, channeling her emotions into action rather than despair. After Dorothea's abrupt departure, Will Ladislaw is left seething with anger, while Rosamond is stunned into silence. She had believed in her power over Will, but his harsh words shatter that illusion. He furiously rejects her, blaming her for ruining his one certainty, Dorothea's belief in him. Rosamond, for the first time, experiences true rejection and is left devastated. Will, consumed by rage and regret, paces around, torn between leaving and the strange pull of responsibility toward Rosamond's misery. When he finally speaks, asking if he should visit Lydgate later, Rosamond, barely audible, agrees. After he leaves, she faints and remains weak until a servant finds her. Lydgate returns home early to find Rosamond unwell. Assuming Dorothea's visit upset her, he comforts her with unexpected tenderness, and she clings to him in uncharacteristic dependence. Later, Lydgate finds Dorothea's letter and learns of her support. Will arrives, acting as if he had just arrived in town, avoiding any mention of his earlier meeting with Rosamond. Lydgate informs him of the scandal tying his name to Bulstrode. Will dismisses the gossip bitterly, realizing his name now carries shame. As Lydgate speaks of leaving Middlemarch, Will sees his own future reflected in him, a slow surrender to circumstance. He fears he is already stepping onto that path, losing his sense of purpose. Dorothea returns from her exhausting day of advocacy for Lydgate, feeling emotionally drained. Back at home, Dorothea finally allows herself to confront the depth of her feelings for Will. In solitude, she collapses in heartbreak, whispering, "Oh, I did love him." The agony of betrayal and the loss of her quiet, unspoken hope crush her. She sobs through the night, battling anger, humiliation, and despair, feeling torn between her love for Will and the pain of seeing him with Rosamond. By morning, a shift occurs. Instead of sinking into bitterness, Dorothea chooses action. She resolves to help Rosamond despite her own suffering, believing that turning her grief into purpose is the only way forward. With newfound determination, she sets out once again for Middlemarch, ready to face Rosamond. Dorothea returned to Rosamond's house the next morning, determined to complete her unfinished purpose. She met Lydgate at the door, who, unaware of what had transpired the day before, welcomed her warmly. He informed her that Rosamond had been unwell, but believed she would be cheered by Dorothea's visit. With that, he left Dorothea alone with Rosamond, assuming it was simply another act of kindness. Rosamond, wary and uncertain, received Dorothea with distant politeness, fearing that she had come to confront her about Will Ladislaw. But Dorothea's approach was gentle and sincere. She took Rosamond's hand and began to speak about Lydgate, not with judgment, but with admiration and concern. She assured Rosamond that Lydgate was not guilty of any wrongdoing, and that he had friends who still believed in him. Dorothea's kindness and warmth slowly melted Rosamond's cold reserve. As Dorothea spoke of marriage and the pain of misunderstandings, Rosamond was deeply moved. Overcome with emotion, she broke down crying. Dorothea, caught in her own wave of sorrow, held her hand in silent comfort. In that moment, their pride and distance vanished, and Rosamond, overwhelmed by a sense of honesty she had never known before, made a confession. Will had never loved her. He had only spoken to her the day before to make it clear that no other woman existed for him but Dorothea. Dorothea was struck by this revelation, not with immediate joy, but with a deep, stirring relief. She assured Rosamond that she had done the right thing in telling her the truth, and in return, Dorothea spoke of Lydgate's devotion to his wife, hoping to rekindle Rosamond's love for him. As they parted, Lydgate returned, noticing the change in his wife's demeanour. She admitted that Dorothea was better than anyone she had ever known. Lydgate, tired and resigned to his burdens, found a small comfort in Rosamond's renewed attention toward him. Though life had narrowed his dreams, he accepted it, ready to carry his fragile wife's happiness upon his shoulders. Dorothea left with a lighter heart, her painful doubts about Will dispelled. Though her own path remained uncertain, at least she had helped mend another's, an act of kindness that, in its own way, soothed her soul. Will Ladislaw had exiled himself from Middlemarch, but as time passed, his reasons for staying away weakened. He longed to hear news of Dorothea, and as his resolve softened, he found a practical excuse to return, a charitable project in need of funding, which he thought might justify speaking to Bulstrode. This made the trip seem less like a personal indulgence and more like a duty. But upon arriving, Will found Middlemarch in turmoil. The scandal surrounding Bulstrode had touched many lives, including Lydgate's. Will had meant only to visit briefly, see old friends, and leave. But things quickly became complicated, especially with Rosamond. After their painful encounter, he was tormented by guilt and confusion. He had lashed out at her in anger, yet he felt the weight of her sadness. He dreaded staying, but something held him back from leaving altogether. To clear his mind, Will took a coach to a nearby town for the day. He considered escaping to London, but the thought of Dorothea, of what had happened between them, kept him tethered. In the evening, he returned and visited Lydgate's house, where Rosamond greeted him with an eerie quiet. As she poured his tea, she slipped him a small folded note, unnoticed by Lydgate. Later that night, alone in his room, Will opened the note. It was brief, but life-changing. Rosamond had told Dorothea the truth. She had set the record straight. Dorothea now knew that Will had never loved Rosamond, that his heart had belonged only to her. At first relief washed over him, but then uncertainty crept in. How had Dorothea reacted? Did she believe Rosamond's words? Or had this revelation changed her feelings toward him forever? Lying in bed, Will's mind was restless. He longed to see Dorothea again, but he did not know if their world, once so full of light and purity, was still unbroken. Would she ever look at him the same way again? Dorothea had spent 2 long, restless days since visiting Rosamond. Though she had finally slept, an unbearable energy stirred within her. She tried to quiet her thoughts, reading, studying maps, distracting herself with small tasks, but nothing could calm the storm inside her. It was as if her heart was waiting, yearning for something she dared not name. Then suddenly Miss Noble arrived. The frail little woman clutched her lozenge box, her voice trembling. Will Ladislaw was outside. He feared he had hurt Dorothea and begged for just a moment of her time. Dorothea froze. For so long she had lived by rules, rules of duty, rules of propriety, rules of silence. But what did they mean now? Nothing. Nothing at all. When Will entered, he hesitated, as if afraid to come too close. His voice was raw, as he spoke of his past, the shame of his family name, the gossip, the cruel judgment of others. He told her how he had refused Bulstrode's money, knowing she would despise him if he took it. He had believed she might think less of him, might turn away. Dorothea's heart ached. "Nothing could change how I see you," she whispered, "except believing that you were not as good as I thought." The storm outside raged, wind and rain battering the windows, as if the world itself were trembling with them. Lightning split the sky, and suddenly, without thinking, their hands found each other, clasping tightly. Will's voice was anguished. "It is impossible," he said. "Even if you loved me as I love you, we can never belong to each other. I have nothing. I can offer you nothing." Dorothea's breath caught, her heart breaking under the weight of unspoken longing. And then, at last, the dam burst. "I don't care about poverty," she cried, her voice trembling with tears. "I hate my wealth. I need so little. I would give it all away just to be with you." In that moment, the weight of all their sorrow, all their longing, melted away. Will pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he would never let go. For the first time there were no barriers between them, no words left unspoken, no more silence, only love. In the quiet gardens of Freshet Hall, the air is filled with talk of politics and family matters. But soon a far more pressing issue takes centre stage. News of Dorothea's engagement to Will Ladislaw. The announcement, delivered by her uncle Mr. Brooke, is met with shock, disbelief, and even anger. Sir James, deeply upset, sees the marriage as a disgrace, believing Will to be beneath Dorothea's status, and worse, an opportunist taking advantage of her. Mrs. Cadwallader, ever sharp-tongued, claims she had foreseen it all along, while Celia, Dorothea's gentle sister, is simply confused. How could Dodo, who once vowed never to marry again, choose someone so unlike her late husband? Amid the tense conversation, Mr. Brooke tries to be supportive, offering to cut off Dorothea's inheritance so that no one can claim Will is after her wealth. But even that does little to soothe Sir James, who refuses to visit Dorothea, unable to bear what he sees as her terrible mistake. Later, Celia, ever the loving sister, cannot resist going to see Dorothea. She arrives at Lowick, her heart full of concern. As they sit close together, knee to knee, Celia tries to understand. "Why, Dodo?" she asks softly. "Why would you do this?" Dorothea, ever patient, listens. Celia worries for her. How will she live? Will she be happy? Will they ever see each other again? Tears come to Celia's eyes, but Dorothea, with quiet strength, reassures her. "I have promised to marry Will," she says, "and I am going to marry him." Celia, sensing the deep certainty in her sister's voice, finally lets go of her protest. "Is he very fond of you?" she asks. Dorothea smiles, her heart warm. "I hope so," she says. "I am very fond of him." And with that, Celia settles in, no longer fighting the tide. She wishes things were different, but most of all, she just wants her sister to be happy. As the sisters sit together, the storm of the outside world fades. In this moment, it is just them, two hearts bound by love despite their differences. Every ending is also a beginning. As life moves forward, we can't help but wonder, what became of those we've followed so closely? Did their stories unfold as we had hoped? Did they find happiness, or did time reshape their dreams in unexpected ways? Tertius Lydgate, brilliant but burdened, found success in his medical career, though he always saw himself as a failure. He never became the great reformer he once dreamed of being, instead settling into the comfortable life of a doctor, catering to wealthy patients. Rosamond, his wife, never repeated her past mistakes. She remained graceful, composed, and ever convinced of her own righteousness. When Lydgate died at 50, she remarried, this time to an older, wealthier physician, ensuring a life of comfort. She often spoke of her happiness as a reward, though she never quite said for what. And then there was Dorothea. She had left behind wealth and status to follow her heart, and though many whispered that she had thrown her life away, she never once regretted marrying Will Ladislaw. Their love was deep, unshaken by doubt or hardship. Will pursued a career in politics, fighting passionately for reform, while Dorothea stood beside him, not in the grand ways some had expected, but in the quiet, unwavering support of a wife who believed in her husband's cause. Some, like Sir James Chetham, never approved of their union. Others felt that Dorothea, a woman of such intelligence and spirit, had been wasted in the life of a mere politician's wife. But those who truly knew her understood. Her purpose had never been about position or power. It was about devotion, about finding meaning in the love she had chosen. Time softened even old wounds. Her sister Celia, once horrified by Dorothea's choices, could not bear to stay away when she heard that Dorothea had given birth to a son. And so slowly the family was made whole again. Dorothea's son, inheriting the Brooke estate, grew into a man of strong convictions, though he refused to enter Parliament, preferring to keep his voice free. As the years passed, Middlemarch remembered Dorothea in whispers. A young woman who had married an aging scholar and then a man with no fortune, no title. A woman who had given up everything for love. But history is written by those who make a spectacle of their lives. Dorothea was never one of them. Her greatness was not in titles or riches, but in the quiet, invisible ways she changed the lives around her. Like a river that splits into 1,000 streams, never grand in name, but giving life wherever it touches. For the world does not only move forward through great names and mighty acts, it is carried by the many who live faithfully, who love deeply, and who leave behind them no monuments, only the quiet echo of their goodness in the lives they have touched. And so their stories fade into time. But somewhere, in the warm glow of an open window, Mary and Fred still laugh as they once did. Somewhere Lydgate still dreams of what might have been, and somewhere, under the wide sky, Dorothea and Will, hand in hand, walk forward, not towards history, but towards the life they chose, together. The End.